welcome back to the latest episode of the Threshold Lab. And today's conversation is one that I've had starred on the calendar and somebody that I've had in mind to be a guest on this show for quite a while. And I think as we get into this conversation, people are going to quickly uncover why I think she has so much insight and wisdom to pass along, not only through some of her direct coaching experience, but also some of the work that she's doing now in creating a community and serving coaches and leaders through a lot of different principles around sport and whatnot. So I'm beyond excited to welcome Becky Burleigh to the conversation today, and really excited to explore some of these topics with you today, Becky. So I just want to start by just giving my appreciation for you taking some time for it.
It's my pleasure. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, I think it's an advantage and a challenge when you converse with somebody like yourself, because of everything that you've done and you've accomplished and the people that you've served. There was a long list of things that I thought we could get into in this conversation. The challenge was, how do we simplify it and really hone in on the things that could maybe really move the needle for other coaches that are listening. But I think an important place to maybe start is almost through some reflection. Now, your career as a more traditional coach spanned multiple decades, and we'll kind of get into some of the nuances of that as well as what you're doing now. But I kind of want to pinpoint your coaching career for a moment. And when, I think a lot of times when coaches start out, they start thinking about values and words and things that they want to live into and coach into within their programs. But I'm now on the back end of your career within coaching. I'd be curious, like, as you reflect back, if there were a word or certain words that you think best encapsulate your journey as a coach, which ones surface for you today?
Well, it's actually funny that you asked that because I think if you had asked me that question really early in my career, especially when it came to like populating talent in my program, I would look at hardworking, committed, focused, like all these different words. And later in my career, I think I would look at the two words that come to my mind are curious, because I think if someone's curious, they're going to always be looking to get better, and that's going to parlay it into performance. And then empathetic, because I think if you can take the perspective of someone else, you're probably going to be an amazing teammate. And so if you have a great performer and a great teammate, you would think that's going to lead to results.
When you think about those two words, where do you see them come from, and or who do you feel like helped influence those two things the most for you as a developing coach and leader?
I would say the curious part was partially just due to my circumstances as I evolved as a coach, because I was never an assistant coach, first of all, which is an unusual path. I was a head coach at 21 for college team, which not sure I recommend, but it was a great learning experience, and I was surrounded by some terrific administrators and other coaches who really helped me, and I was able to ask for help because you're 21, they're like, yeah, you kind of need help. And then you get to Florida, and I'm only 5 years later. So, despite the fact that I have some experience at that point, I'm still really young, and I'm in this massive, high spotlight place like the University of Florida, surrounded by incredible coaches. And so being able to go to those other coaches and administrators and ask for help and be curious about how they did things, I think that just sort of came into its own based on my circumstances. I think the empathetic piece, I don't think I was a really great teammate when I was in college and maybe even before. And I think it was because I was just like, I was really convicted about like how to do things. And, my way was the right way. And I wasn't so interested in moving people into my way as I was in judging the fact that they weren't in my way. And so as I grew, like in my coaching, you just come into contact with people from so many different places and different backgrounds, and you get the understanding that not how is anybody going to be in your way when your way is based on your own personal experiences. And so I think that coaching experience really softened my stance and moved me from judgment to empathy.
It's a really powerful shift to go through, and not only again through some experience, but also some guidance that it sounds like you had people in your corner in that community. And I know now with a lot of the work that you do, part of that is rooted in creating this community around coaches. So, but I'd like to maybe double tap a moment on the curious piece of it. And this may be a little challenging to kind of go back in time. You touched on this, but when you started out and you were 21 years old and you're thrust into a head coaching role, what do you feel like those questions, what were the main questions that you felt like you were asking then? And then my part two of this will be, how did you see those questions evolve as you progressed through your coaching career?
Well, I think they would have been a lot broader back then. Like, what the heck am I supposed to be doing here? Kind of thing. Um, I was really lucky because I had some very good people at Berry College where I started. Some of the other coaches there had tons of experience and were really awesome. And so they would just sort of guide me and nudge me. And I wouldn't even say they were just like, man, what are you doing? Like they were just more like, maybe you should think about this. And then that approach really informed me because it helped me find my own way without them telling me how to do it. But at the same time, they weren't going to let me go down a path that might not be great. So that to me was a huge step in my career. And I think it's interesting that you bring it up about the community part because I really think that played a role in why I'm passionate about what I do now because I know how much I benefited from having that type of community. And I know that not everybody does have that. And so if I can play my part in helping to create that for someone, I feel like that's a huge win.
I think that certainly speaks. I mean, all the conversations that I've heard from you and some of the work that you've done with what drives winning, that thread shows up in so many of them in terms of how you're now giving and supporting coaches and leaders with by creating again not just solo but together. And this is I'll ask one more question pertaining to questions for a moment, and maybe some of this again hits on what you were describing. I think when you interview or have a conversation with a coach who brings a wealth of experience, a common tendency is to want to know, like, hey, like, what's the piece of advice that you'd wish maybe you received early on or that maybe you discovered later? I'm almost interested in the inverse, though, is what's a question that maybe you wish somebody would have asked you earlier on in your career that maybe you stumbled into or you discovered later?
It's funny that like coaches of all kinds and not just athletic coaches, like we have game plans for everything. And yet we don't really create a game plan for our career. It just kind of evolves and happens. And so I think I wish someone had kind of asked me about like questions around how are you going to be intentional about how you put yourself into this career that's a very physically, emotionally, mentally immersive career, and yet still do that and come out on the other side of it, which in my case was like 30 years later, feeling like you made good choices and were able to see things other than just your competition or just your career life. And I mean, I think I kind of lucked into that. I think that's really unusual to kind of luck into that. And partially because I had friends and family who weren't as invested in my results or my outcomes. And that helped me. But a lot of people people are really invested in what you do for a living. They love that you're a sports coach. They love that your team is playing on television. And I think that can get really confusing.
It can certainly create different challenges, especially when we think about our identity, our self-worth as a coach, how quickly that can get tied to results, how quickly it can get tied to things that society deems as most important. There was a really great recent clip that I heard from another podcast with Sean McVay, him talking a lot about, that kind of quote unquote arrival fallacy. With winning a Super Bowl and or playing in the Super Bowl and thinking like, oh, when I win one, I'll be happy when. And part of it too is he said the trap he fell into was starting to really define success by somebody else's metric, by somebody else's scoreboard. And I thought that was just such a great, powerful sentiment. And I think, as we kind of continue to look at your career maybe as a whole in reflection, as you began your career at 21, how, if at all, did maybe your own definition of success as a coach evolve through your coaching journey? And if it did change, how so, how and why?
I think my path that is a little bit unique in the sense of, I played at D3. My first stop was NAI, which is largely Division two now. And then my stop at Florida was D1, and then a short stint with professional. And so kind of have covered a lot of bases there. And I think that my upbringing in the D3 space, my college coach, Joe Pereira, was a huge mentor for me in terms of he cared for me as a person as much as he cared for me as a player. And honestly, I wasn't that great of a player, so maybe it was more as a person. But but I think that it just showed like his investment in me and my teammates. That sort of sets a pattern or a tone that I think I carried throughout my entire career. And, in referencing back to what you were talking about the Sean McVay thing, what drives winning? We have classes at the University of Florida. They're master's level classes in high performance coaching. We have an entire class that's called What's Really Important, based on the book that Brett Ledbetter, my business partner, wrote around how do you measure success and how do you look at what society measures compared to what's important to you and compare those two and make choices based on that. And that is that whole topic is a fascinating topic for any high performer.
Within that topic alone, we could spend the rest of the
We could.
conversation
We
certainly
certainly
right
could.
diving in and there's a part of me that wants to I'm gonna touch on it and we'll see where it goes. Maybe we do, maybe we don't. But um, whether this was through your own experience or coaches that you now serve and give to now, how did you and or have helped others separate like who you coach and what you do from like who you are so that those outcomes and results aren't the full depiction of your worth as a person?
Interesting question because we've literally taken tons of athletes, coaches, different people through that exercise, not just in our UF classes, but in our consulting too. And I think sometimes we just need a reminder of like, okay, here's what we're going to sacrifice to be in this because it does take what it takes. There's no way around that. But if you go into that with eyes wide open and you're making intentional choices versus things just start rolling down that hill and you can't stop that rock anymore, that's a whole different type of energy. And then, recognizing like, are you protecting what's most important to you? And people do that in different ways. I felt like even in my coaching at the University of Florida, I might have been a little off the beaten path. Like, I have a Vespa, so I drove a Vespa to work every day, and I'm not sure that was like very typical for a University of Florida coach at that point, Um, I had some outside interests that I enjoyed, but like I always felt like those helped me be refreshed for the times when I was in front of my team and I wanted to be the best version of myself. I could do that better with a refresher than I could do that if I was just grinding, grinding, grinding.
There's a term, I think it comes from a gentleman, Brad Stolberg, who wrote a book kind of around some of this, but he talks about like having this like rugged flexibility to your identity, right? And just having to be more expansive to these other things. And one of the things that at some point I did want to dive into in the conversation is that emotional toll and mental toll that coaching can certainly have, but I think certainly identity could be tied into that. How before we kind of start to transition to that, as we've kind of talked a little bit about identity as a leader, getting kind of clarity around what's important to you and your definition of success. Was there a moment, an aha moment at any time as you were coaching that maybe started to shift your perception of how important that was and just how it shapes you as a coach or leader?
I'm not sure I can point to one particular moment. I do think having success early for me really was helpful because you do see the other side of it and you see that you're really not different afterwards. And once you see that you're not different afterwards, it makes you understand like the choices that you're going to make in the pursuit of that need to be intentional. And it's not that you put any less of yourself into it. As a matter of fact, I think it's more freeing because you don't have the fear piece around it of like, well, what if I go my whole career and I don't win a championship of any kind? And when you know what the championship is, it's like, okay, like I can put my whole self into this, knowing that I can be okay with whatever the outcome gives us. It does not say, well, be complacent and don't care as much. That's totally the opposite of it. It's actually the freedom to be able to put your whole self in there because you're not taking part of your emotional energy away with the fear part.
You've highlighted that word intentional, right? A few times. Coincidentally, a gentleman that I just had on the podcast, Phil Beckner, who is a well-regarded development coach, particularly amongst basketball, but he's now kind of broadened that out. It was the word that came up for him when we started to talk about like good versus great athletes, but also coaches too. I think it's obviously an easy thing to say, hey, I want to be intentional. For you as a coach, what were some of the concrete ways being intentional showed up for you in the way you led?
I was fortunate, and I know not everybody is fortunate to be able to, like, my parents moved to Gainesville, and so I was able to have this mix of a family life right there, as well as an incredible career at the University of Florida. And my mom was handicapped most of her life, in a wheelchair a lot of her life. And so when you're in that environment all the time, like I think the perspective that that gives you to not take things for granted or to recognize like how easily things can be taken away, that it just helps you stay grounded. And then, I think about like, my college teammates who are a very close friend group of mine. Even my friends from Barry and my friends from Florida, like, yeah, some of my friends at Florida particularly were other coaches and we were all in the same competitive cauldron. But a lot of my friends were outside of that too. And they were in the university, like not in the athletic association. And so I think I always was able to maintain some type of connection with people that weren't so rooted specifically in athletics. That helped me. I'm not saying that helps everybody, but that definitely helped me.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's so much to be said about I guess the role of, even being resilient as a leader, as a coach, and yet we know the importance of social support and again the community and playing a role in that. So it makes a ton of sense. It also aligns with what you described as a former D3 athlete that had as a fellow D3 athlete, this what you shared resonated a lot because it's one of the things that I was incredibly gracious for is having an identity that did stem beyond just what happened between the lines in a sport. It gave you a sense, and I think it certainly has had carryover now. Um, so I think within all of that, I think I hear in one hand, when you think about the pressures and the challenges that go into coaching, there's the people you surround yourself with play an immense valuable role in helping with that. As you also think about other things when it comes to coaching at the highest level with what it takes emotionally, mentally, physically, energy wise, um, how did you learn to kind of notice either when your capacity or that toll was maybe being stretched too far?
That's a really good question because I didn't get married until much later in my career, and I kind of think, thank goodness, because I don't know like how like if I wasn't intentional enough with my energy in those early years, and I'm not sure that would have been good for anyone, besides myself, maybe, and even maybe not for myself if we're being really critical. So I think that when when you bring home leftover energy, which I think is kind of a norm for a lot of coaches or high performers, like, and you're identifying that the people who matter most to you are your family, but then when you are actually there, you're bringing home leftover energy. That's a bit of a wake up call that can happen on the daily, and we talk about that in our UF classes too, because it's it's kind of I feel like it's shifting a little bit, but it's kind of been celebrated to be that person who slept at their desk or first one in, last one out. And I don't know that that's still the same mantra for a lot of people. I know there's a lot of coaches who institute like family days with their teams and things like that. And I don't think it's about, again, less work. It's about knowing when there's a diminishing returns of what you're giving because of your limited or diminished capacity.
There's a so I don't think I've ever um, formulated this in this way, but I'll share this, and this is probably going to be polarizing. So there's going to be people listening to this, coaches that are like, "Screw you, Zach, for saying this." But so I had a mentor in grad school in sports psychology, Ken Ravizza, who has done great work within kind of the sports psychology space at multiple levels. Something he used to always share that he framed it towards athletes, but I think there's a connection here with coaching. He would always say like, and he would use a little more colorful language that I'll refrain from, but he would always say like, "Are you that bad that you have to feel good to perform well? Or are you that bad that you have to put in all these extra hours to get these, particularly these results, that there's other ways than just trying hard and, working smarter and all these things." But I think in maybe the same vein is to your point, we've traditionally coaching, there's almost been this badge of honor of not sleeping, spending long hours, spending the night at the facility, and just constantly being consumed in it. And there's an element of it where I'm almost wondering too, it's like, hey, like, are you that bad in essence that you have to, it has to get to that point for you to do your job and do it well. Now, again, there's sacrifices and all those things and whatnot. But I say all that because I think that what you're describing is so important is how do you foster these habits and this awareness around these things so that way you have something to go to refuel yourself. So maybe with even in that, as a coach, for you, what were those habits, whether it was done in the morning, evening, weekly, and so on, that just helped you reset and refuel so you could show up as the best version of yourself?
One of the things I loved about my experience at Florida was initially, and for the vast majority of my career, I was in a building with a bunch of coaches from a bunch of different sports. And I know that's kind of going the wayside because everybody's got their own facilities and things like that, which I'm a little sad about, if I have to be honest. But one of the things that was so awesome about that was the ability to just walk down the hall. One, you could walk down the hall and ask questions of people, but also just like walk down the hall and have like a 2 or 3 minute break with another coach where, you're just basically talking about nothing, or just the easy access of that. And even in the athletic setting, we have access to a weight room, we have access to a stadium where we can do what we used to call Gator Mountains, and so like that was so easy. And the like our athletic director Jeremy Foley was in the weight room every day at noon. And I mean, there was never any explicit expectation that you should be in the weight room at noon, but I always kind of felt like if he could do it, and he's got way more on his plate than I do, probably, I should be able to do that. And so I think some of that modeling that we saw in that environment and the accessibility to things just made it a healthier environment. And we had, pizza luncheons on the Fridays of football games on Saturdays for the entire athletic association. We had golf scrambles, and I am horrible at golf, but like it was more a social event, And so I think even the highest performing organizations can create time and space, and more importantly, create the modeling to show that those things pay off and they do not conflict with productivity. And matter of fact, they may increase productivity.
Yes, yeah. In a profession where so much of what you do is give, give, give all the time, and you're the person again, people are constantly going to you for things. It's like, one, how do you, who gives to you, one, but also two, like, how do you give to yourself, and what does that look like? And I think that's such an important thing to find, hopefully on the sooner end than the later end, when you reach a point of, burnout and different things like that. I think
Can,
this
can I add
ties,
one thing to that? Because I
please.
think you have a great point. It is really hard, at least for me, it was very hard to like when I have gotten so much reinforcement for being a hard worker and even as a D3 player, like that was probably my best trait, like and so when you're getting reinforcement for that, like to say, okay, I got to find a way that's different than just outworking everyone, it's a little scary because you're like, well, it's worked so far, and I don't know what else I got if I don't do that. But I also think you can train inefficiency, meaning, if I know I'm going to spend, an extra 3 hours after practice in my office, when if I don't have that time, I'm probably going to get really tight on what I need to get done before practice because I can't spend that time. So there's just so many ways of looking at things that doesn't dismiss that it takes what it takes, but that also show you how important it is. Like it's not a selfish act to take care of you. Matter of fact, it's probably the best thing you can do for those you lead is take care of you.
There are some people that I think we have mutual ties to that I've heard somebody like a Chris Peterson talk about the illusion of control. And I wonder, and I'm curious for you, like how that also maybe plays into this, because I think you bring up such a good example with, I've seen this with players. There are some players that coaches love coaching, that hard worker, that guy that shows up and wants to lead by example, and it's the person that you can rely on and count on to put themselves in the best position possible to succeed. Now, we also know that there can come a fine point where that can become a trap. And, a question I think we reflect on a lot is, am I struggling because I'm not working hard enough? Or is it because I can't let go of what's outside of my control? As a coach, as a leader, for you, how did you see that maybe illusion of control also play into one's ability to coach freely and to also protect their bandwidth?
Well, Chris Peterson is amazing, by the way. I've just given him a little shout
Yeah.
out there. He sort of helped co-produce What Drives Winning Environments with us, and that's another book and another class at UF. And What Drives Winning Environments is all about how do you define, manage, and model the expectations you have for your organization. And you can do all of that, which you feel like is in your control. And it is, right? And still have things happen that fall outside of your control. And I remember one time we had this Florida head coaches collaboration, and Brett, my business partner, threw out the question like, what percent from 0 to 100 do you think you are in control of the outcomes of your events? And I don't remember everybody else's answers. I know mine was really high. And so as the conversation went on and we talked about like all these different things, like you start to realize like, wow, like it is like way lower than you think. And I was talking about this recently with someone. So like we won a national championship. Our leading goal scorer was a woman named Danielle Fotopoulos. Danielle transferred to Florida, so I didn't even recruit her initially, right? She transferred because she was getting married to her husband who lived in Florida. I had no control over their marriage plans. Danielle because she was a leading scorer, attracted Abby Wambach, who came to our team as a freshman when Danielle was a senior. We don't win a national championship if we don't have Abby and Danielle as twin strikers up top. Abby doesn't come if Danielle's not there. Danielle doesn't come if she's not getting married to her husband in Tampa. So it's like, and you could just list 1,000 of those things. In that national championship game, North Carolina could have scored 10 times and we won 1-0. So how much control do you really have? I think your point about there being the illusion of control is spot on.
I, much like you, have a deep respect for Chris. Not only having him on the show, he came and he spoke at our summit that we hosted this past spring, and shared certainly a lot. I know you all echo a lot of similar sentiments. There's another one that I've heard both from him, I've heard from you. It doesn't matter who said what, but like I would love to hear how this particular quote or question shows up for you, because I think another piece that you're touching on is when it comes to managing our bandwidth in coaching and having a robust identity that's flexible and things like that, it requires perspective too. And so one of the questions that I've loved that I've heard from you and him is this, like, who are you becoming as a result of this chase? And I'm curious, just from your own experience with that. I've obviously heard a little bit of his, but maybe how has that question resonated for you? And is there a particular moment where you feel like, and when was that maybe moment where you felt like it really struck a chord?
Well, I would tell you that, first of all, I've had that in every office. I have it right there. Um, and I had it in my office at Florida. I had it in my office when I was coaching in Orlando. I just think it's a great daily reminder of, are you becoming more or less of who you want to be? And I would say, there was probably a time in my career right after we won the national championship where I think I was becoming a little less of who I wanted to be because I was just getting swept up in you know, the fame or whatever you want to call it of winning a national championship. And um, that to me, like, do you ever really know like the moment it happens? That's what's scary about it. You don't. It's kind of like just seeps into your environment in little ways, and then all of a sudden you look back and you're like, who is this person? And then you have to recalibrate and get back to who you want to be. But if you have that daily reminder, like I do now and have quite recently for a while, that's a quote from Jim Lair, Dr. Jim Lair, who, yeah, I think we've kind of tweaked it a little bit, but man, what a great question that is, to kind of recalibrate you when you need it.
There's, I mean, again, I could probably spend this whole time continuing to dive a little bit more into just for you and your own development and growth as a coach, and maybe we come back to this, but I do also, you've used the word environment, right, a few times, and that's such an integral piece to effective leadership. Is it just how we are showing up at an individual level as a leader, but also that environment that we're creating for other people to do their best work? So, I'm for you, when you reflect back on your kind of your coaching career, what were maybe the systems, traditions, rituals, and things and so on that maybe you found really helpful and effective to kind of make create that kind of optimal learning environment?
Well, I think one of the reasons we think about environment because it has an immediacy to it. When Brett and Chris talk in the What Drives Winning Environments book about culture versus environment, culture feels like long term and environment feels like right now. And so, what are you doing like kind of daily to create an environment? And one of the things, like, this is just one of the first things that comes to my mind. I could probably think of a dozen others, but like when I was at Methodist college, the D3 school, our alumni, like it was a big deal to be part of the alumni. And I think I was maybe the second or third class that started that program. So there weren't very many alumni before me. So then when I became an alum, it was taken very seriously that it was like your job as part of the alum to like continue this tradition. Well, at Berry College, same thing. Like alumni was really important. Get to Florida. We hadn't even have our program yet. So we started an alumni group, which is still, I was just there last weekend. We had alumni weekend. And it's just one of those things that it just helps you play for something bigger than yourself. And I think when that purpose comes out that it's like bigger than yourself, that's where you can really get a lot of the fuel for reminding yourself of like the daily habits that you have to do or the things that aren't the best parts of your job because you're aware of your purpose. When you can't really recall or find that purpose, I think that's when it's time to consider like, do you need to do something different? Because maybe that purpose isn't driving you in the same way that it did. So that to me, that difference between like environment and culture that Brett and Chris talk about was really important.
With that, what would be maybe either unanticipated and or yeah, I'll use the word unanticipated or unintended, like environmental kind of forces that maybe as you navigated your coaching journey that you started to look for, or that you started to be really more intentional, like again using that define manage model kind of
Hmm.
piece of it. When it came to managing the environment for you all, what were some of those maybe unexpected or just more micro things forces that you would really pay attention to and try to be really intentional with as you progress through your coaching journey?
Well, one of the things we talk about in what drives winning environments is like, what are the things that catch you off guard? And as a coach, that's a daily occurrence. You're dealing with 18 to 22-year-olds, maybe 24-year-olds now. But if you can think about the things that catch you off guard, right? Like those are going to be things that you're going to have to manage, and you're going to either gain or lose credibility in the way that you manage them. There are also things that are predictable events. Like predictable events are you're going to have players on your team who hate you because you haven't played them. And how are you going to manage that? But that's predictable. So, like, can you get a hold of that both so that you have bandwidth to deal with the things that are unpredictable? And I think when it comes to, what you're saying about the unintended consequences, I mean, I can think of 100 things where I have probably sent like a mixed message without intending to send a mixed message. Like if I'm saying, in our game, everybody talks about keeping possession. And so like to keep possession, you have to kind of have like a calmness about it. And as a coach, I would be like, keep it. Well, that's a mixed message just in my tone. And so like magnify that times 10, 100, however many you want of things that, you might not realize you're sending the mixed signal because you're in it and the people receiving it are looking at it as a mixed signal. So being able to like audit that and even have outside people audit that for you. I remember one time our tennis coach sat on our bench during a game and he was watching our game, and afterwards we went for lunch the next day, and I was like, what feedback are you going to give me? And I knew he wasn't going to give me like soccer feedback because he's a tennis coach. But he was like, well, one of the things I really noticed was I felt like there was a disconnect between messages from different coaches during the game. And he gave me some examples of that. I sat in that exact same game, had no idea that was happening. And so when you can have other people point out your mixed signals, and then I'll just share one really, really powerful one for me. It was during COVID and social justice and George Floyd. And we talked to our team about a lot of things all the time. Definitely daily activity for us would be, having some of these conversations. And I remember one of my athletes came up to me and said, hey, I just want you to consider that all the times that you show us like clips, how many times have you showed us a clip of someone that was a minority that wasn't an athlete or an entertainer? Because that's a message too. Like, is it only important that that's the only messages that are going to be resonant? And so, I had to like look in the mirror on that one and think, really great point, you know? And so, what message am I sending by doing that? And so when you can kind of reflect back, micro or macro, and look at some things that you might be doing that might send a mixed message, I think it really helps to get clarity and be able to define and then ultimately manage better because you've gotten clarity.
This may not have been a word that you directly shared in that story and that example, but I think it's very powerful in all this is the role of feedback, right? And the role of feedback too in fostering a high performing environment. And, again, I'll kind of go back to this um, what am I trying to say? This interview that I saw with Sean McVay, and he's talking a little bit about how he fostered psychological safety in with his as a coach and what's helped him. And he talks about psychological safety not being about avoiding the hard truths, but rather creating a space where people can handle them. Now, in order to do that, great leaders can't just give feedback, they have to invite it as well. And so for you, that's one of the pieces that I hear in that example is being open to having a truth teller or somebody there to kind of help provide feedback. Um, when you now coach others or give support other coaches around the role of feedback or having somebody there to kind of be a truth teller for you, um, how does that now show up in those that you serve?
You have hit on such a great topic right there. We could spend another whole hour on that.
Yeah.
When I first met Brett, he was working with my team at Florida, and he was definitely a truth teller. And I'll be honest with you, like there were times where I'm like, with friends like you, who needs enemies? Kind of thing. And so I don't even think I responded that well to the truth telling. And he still continued to give me the truth, which, man, if you got somebody like that in your life, keep them close because a lot of people, like I've asked this question to teams, if you give feedback to somebody and they respond poorly, how many of you guys are going to do it again? Maybe if you're lucky, half the room will raise their hand. What about a third time? You're down to like one or two people at that point. And so the ability to take the feedback is just as important as the ability to give the feedback. And I want to give a shout out to Lisa Fortier. She's the Gonzaga women's basketball coach because she said something I had never thought of before, but she was talking about exit interviews. All of our athletes go through the exit interviews, and she was talking about how she really wanted to see it. Well, what she realized was she really just wanted to see the good things they wrote, right? And I know as a coach, I've been like, "Ooh, I wonder who said that," like, and then the vice versa too. But she had this little twist on it in a conversation that she had with Brett about when people are giving you feedback, it's not so much about what you're doing badly more than it is about what they need. So if they're giving you feedback about, in her case, she was talking about organization or timely delivery of information. They're planners. They wanted the information sooner. So it's not like you are bad at organization. It's more like I need this to have that psychological safety that you mentioned.
What a wonderful distinction and reframe to also put it in perspective too. But again, as we touched on, this goes so well into how are we designing these optimal environments, these winning environments. And again, we know how important psychological safety is in that, but what a great way to also, I think one of the challenge too is with feedback, sometimes there's this feeling that when you're the person receiving it, there are moments where it can feel almost like an attack on you in essence, or we interpret it in that given way. And what a wonderful way to reframe it in a way where it becomes more meaningful, not only for you and how it gets you into action. So for example, we had a woman speak at our summit, and she talked a little bit about like feedback is great, super valuable for growing as a leader and in teams. She was like, but what we've really gotten intentional with is framing it around feed forward. Like what gets us into action from that? Because sometimes feedback is, hey, I saw you do this and I want to, but there's not necessarily the coaching around, well, how can we move you towards something more productive or whatever. And I think what you described from Lisa is such a great example of how a coach can shift that to get them now into, okay, how do we feed forward and build off of this to be better in the future?
You know, one of the best things about consulting is you get to hear these voices of all these different people in different sports, and you just learn so much in this role. Like I think I've learned more in my, what's it been now, 4 or 5 years of consulting than I've learned in a really big part of my career, because you're so narrow when you're in your career and you get so broad when you're in this role. Like I almost wish I had been a consultant before as a coach, which would have been really bad for anybody who was my consultant at that time. But like, I just think there's so much to learn from other perspectives and getting outside of your sport, and understanding that we all have the same issues. I could probably talk to somebody in Wall Street who has the same issues, as long as I'm willing to make those connections.
There's so much good in that, what I'm finding too is again I want to be mindful too of our time because I know we're going to get into the very back end here of our conversation, and so where I'd want to go, I'm going to bring it back to you for a moment, but where I'd like to go is talking about the feedback in the environment, how important that also is from our players, right? And like not
Hmm.
just coaches and mentors and thought partners and so on, but our players. And you've obviously had an opportunity to serve and coach some incredibly gifted women and athletes. And so when you think of some of them, like a Marta and Abby Wambach and or whoever, what were some of the biggest lessons that you felt like you extracted from your players when it comes to things like leadership and coaching or mindset even over your career?
Wow, like I could literally write a book on that.
Yeah.
You mentioned Marta and the Orlando Pride, and there's two things. Like both Marta and Alex Morgan were on that team, and like that, you could think that those two players could probably cruise in that environment and still be very successful. And neither did either. Like Marta would come out and juggle a tennis ball every day before practice, and she wouldn't even start practice until she got to 100 without dropping it. Alex Morgan was the best warm-up person I've ever seen. Like her detailed attention to detail in terms of like her pre-practice routine, there's no wondering why she had such a long and productive career. But I think it's those things that you don't really see when you're not, because you're not at a game and you're not on the watching it on TV, that just make you realize like what it really takes to be special at what you're doing. And for everybody, it's a different thing, like not everybody's going to come juggle a tennis ball 100 times before practice, but they might have like a really great mental pre-practice routine that gets them prepared. Um, and so I think that idea of taking feedback from your athletes, like they are your best anybody you lead is your best opportunity to grow, because they see things from a different perspective than you do. um and everybody sort of has their own um take on things. I remember this was a Mary Wise, who was the volleyball coach at Florida, retired recently, and one of the things we talked about as she was making her decision to retire was, just remember that like when you make this announcement, everybody is going to think, how does this impact me? Right? And so the reason I bring that up is because when you're coaching, literally you have 30 people or however many people you're leading that are thinking, the decisions I make, how does that impact me? Which is going to be a different perspective for one person who's starting and playing 90 minutes, to another person who hasn't even touched the field yet, to another person who's been there for 5 years and has complete trust in me, to someone who's brand new and doesn't have any trust in me yet. Like, so that's where that feedback comes in, and not being afraid to hear things, and even hear things that hurt, but recognize those things are really just their way of seeing you. And it's like I always felt like it's not personal. I used to keep a box of Q-tips on my desk because quit taking it personally was a reminder that I needed a lot. Um, and I do trust that some of my longevity of my career was my ability to not take those things personally, but to take those as data points instead of like personal attacks on me.
With someone like Alex, Marta, or whoever, maybe a star in that regard, yes, there's the feedback piece of it, which you just touched on beautifully, and also, were there ways in which that you had to find yourself adapt to be able to really coach and lead those individuals, and if so, what did that look like?
Well, first of all, I was like very nervous to go coach the Pride because I'm just like, my God, this roster is loaded. And these are people I'm watching on TV, and I'm not like a fangirl kind of person, but it's still like a different level. And I mean, I had imposter syndrome at every job I ever had. Like starting at Barry, of course, I felt like imposter syndrome at 21. Like, who wouldn't? 26 at Florida, same thing. Coaching the Orlando Pride, same thing. And so I think it's more about like recognizing, like having the humility to understand that all you're trying to do when you go into these environments is add value to the people that you lead. And if you can add value to the people that you lead, at some point, whether they like you or don't like you, there's going to be something in it for them. And so that's kind of how I tried to attack each of the situations that I got myself into was how can I add value to this environment? And sometimes that's a debatable question. Somebody may think you're adding and somebody may think you're not. But that's where you can grow if you're willing to take that in.
So good. This is, and I'm running into this theme where when I have these conversations, I'm like, I wish we had 2 more hours to dive in, or I can't wait for that book eventually that you write, maybe goes into even more depth. But where I want to kind of end with two last questions here, and then we'll get you out of here. But this is probably a pretty standard question in a sense, but I'm now even I wasn't going to ask it, but now I kind of might because I'm curious if it does tie in at all to what you just shared with the imposter syndrome. And I think there's other coaches that certainly encounter that. But if there's a piece of wisdom that you feel like could be passed on to coaches now, or that you wish maybe they leaned into earlier in their careers that they maybe don't, what would that be that you would want them to know and why?
You know, I I think that there's a part of me that felt like, okay, I was probably a little over my head every time I made my stops. I was a little over my head. Well, I was probably a lot over my head when I got to Barry, and I graduated in May and took the job in June. I felt a little over my head when I got to Florida and I'm only 26 years old, and I'm seeing like this massively high performing organization. And then even at whatever I was age wise when I started it in Orlando, like that's just a whole different thing too. Like I hadn't coached at the international level. There's a lot of international players in that league. And even just some of the rules are different in the professional game. So I just think that being willing to like look at yourself as part of the organization, not necessarily the head of the organization. Now, when it comes to the responsibility of like knowing what you need to do, like I will take on all of that responsibility. But from a like when I'm viewing it, I'm also looking at it as I am a part of this. And I want to be collaborative with the people who are in it to make it what it needs to be and not just come in with like my way or the highway. And there's a lot of people who come in my way or the highway and are super successful. And I would never judge that because, honestly, the more you think you can control and maybe actually do, the less room for error there is in that system. It's not as easy when you're collaborative, I think. However, when you're collaborative and it's successful, the buy-in is just off the charts. And so that risk is worth it.
I think that's great. And that brings me, I want to ask this one last question. This is a question I do pose to all the guests at the very end. So, and this could be as it relates to coaching or whatever capacity you'd like to take it. But Becky, what's something that you're proud of that maybe you don't always get an excuse to talk about?
Ooh, that's a really good last question. Um, I think the first thing that's popping in my mind, and I'm not sure why, but I had mentioned earlier that my parents had moved to Gainesville, and I think that given the circumstance of like the high profile nature of what I was doing and the consumption of that job, and being able to be a a good daughter. Both my parents passed away while I was coaching at Florida. Like going through that whole process, I feel really blessed. One, that I was able to, and proximity really helped. Like my mom was in a nursing home the last few years, and it was really close to our practice field, and I could just swing by there right after practice. And like I know that's a luxury. And I know that not everyone is afforded that luxury, but I feel proud of the fact that I was able to be present during that time.
That's I think, a really beautiful sentiment. One, just as its own response, but also to how, again, earlier in this conversation, we talked about the identity and being beyond certainly just on the field and the coaching and how much those other things tied into shaping kind of your career. So I think that's a beautiful full circle moment. And Becky, I just want to thank you again for taking some time. Again, as we said at the beginning, there's a lot of things that are grabbing at your time and your energy. So I'm appreciative of you and honored that you were willing to share with our guest today. And yeah, I just want to thank you.
I loved your questions. I thought they were really thoughtful and expand way beyond just the coaching realm. So thanks for having me.